Amina moved quietly around her small but warm home in Kumasi, hanging bright paper decorations and adjusting the red and green cloth she had carefully spread across the dining table. She wanted everything to feel perfect for Christmas Eve. The smell of spiced rice and grilled chicken drifted from the kitchen, and the flickering lights she had strung around the window gave the room a soft, hopeful glow. She paused now and then, imagining her family sitting together, eating, laughing, and sharing stories. That was her dream every year, to create a Christmas filled with love and unity. But even as she set the table, smoothing each plate and polishing the glasses until they shone, Amina felt a quiet heaviness press against her chest. Kwame, her husband, had hardly spoken to her all day. He moved through the house like a stranger, avoiding her eyes, responding only with short words that felt cold. She wanted to believe he was just tired from work or worried about the holiday expenses, but deep down, something else unsettled her. Still, Amina pushed those thoughts aside. She forced a smile as she tucked sprigs of green into the corners of the room, reminding herself that tonight was about family. Tonight was about laughter and warmth. She whispered a prayer under her breath, asking for peace in her home. As the evening crept closer, she took one last look around the decorated room. It looked festive, beautiful even, but inside her heart she wondered if the love she longed for would finally come, or if the cold distance between her and Kwame would shadow everything. The first knock on the door came just as Amina was adjusting the last set of spoons by the plates. Her heart jumped. She quickly wiped her hands on her cloth and opened the door with a polite smile, though she already knew who it was. Madame Efua, her mother-in-law, stood tall in her wrapper and headscarf, her sharp eyes scanning Amina from head to toe before even stepping inside. She didn't smile. She never did. Instead, she carried that look that always made Amina feel as though nothing she did would ever be good enough. "Merry Christmas, Mama," Amina greeted softly, bowing her head slightly in respect. Madame Efua walked past her without answering, sniffing at the air as though she was already judging the food. At least it smells decent this year," she muttered under her breath. Amina's chest tightened, but she kept her lips pressed in a gentle smile. She had learned to let those words slide, even though each one stung. Soon after, more knocks followed. Kwame's cousins arrived first, laughing loudly, their arms full of gifts and drinks. The children ran straight into the living room, their squeals echoing as they chased one another around the chairs. Amina's sisters-in-law came next, dressed in bright colors, their voices high and full of chatter. They hugged each other quickly, but offered Amina only polite nods, as though she were a stranger. The house filled with noise, music, and the smell of food. Yet beneath the cheer was a thin thread of tension that only Amina seemed to feel. From the corner of the room, Madame Efua sat like a queen on her chosen chair, her eyes following Amina's every move. If Amina poured a drink, those eyes watched. If she adjusted a plate, those eyes followed. When she bent to calm one of the children, Madame Efua shook her head as though she disapproved. It was as if nothing Amina did could escape her judgment. Still, Amina moved gracefully through the room, forcing herself to smile, welcoming each guest as though her heart wasn't heavy. She served drinks, offered small snacks, and made sure everyone felt comfortable. Yet she couldn't ignore the whispers she caught between some relatives, the quick glances in her direction, and the way silence sometimes fell when she walked past. The house was alive with Christmas excitement, laughter mixing with the clinking of glasses, children's footsteps pounding against the floor, and women's voices rising over each other as they shared gossip. But for Amina, every sound felt like a layer added to her anxiety. She wanted this night to be warm and joyful, but under the laughter, she sensed a storm brewing, a storm she could not yet name. She breathed deeply, straightened her shoulders, and told herself to stay strong. The night was only just beginning. The laughter and chatter were at their loudest when the front door opened again. Amina turned, expecting maybe another cousin or neighbor. Instead, her heart stopped. Kwame walked in at last, but he was not alone. His hand was firmly holding that of a young woman, dressed boldly in a tight red dress that sparkled under the lights. Her hair was styled high, her lips painted bright, and her smile wide with the confidence of someone who believed she belonged. For a moment, the entire room froze. Conversations died mid-sentence, laughter cut short, even the children went quiet as if sensing something was terribly wrong. The only sound was the sharp intake of breaths, gasps filling the air like a sudden wind. Amina's hands shook as she clutched the edge of the table, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. "Good evening," Kwame said casually, as though nothing was out of place. He didn't even glance at Amina. Instead, he guided the woman, Zuwena, a name Amina had only heard in whispered rumors, through the center of the room. Zuwena's heels clicked against the floor, each step loud, each step heavy, each one cutting into Amina's chest. The audacity was shocking. Zuwena did not hesitate, did not shy away. With her chin lifted, She walked straight past everyone and slid gracefully into the seat at the head of the table, the very seat reserved for the woman of the home. Amina's seat. The room erupted in uneasy whispers. Some relatives exchanged glances, their mouths open in disbelief. A few covered their faces, as though ashamed to even watch. Madame Efua's eyes lit with something unreadable, surprise mixed with curiosity, but she stayed silent, simply leaning back in her chair to take in the drama. Amina's body burned, yet her face felt cold. Her heart pounded so hard it was almost painful, but she couldn't move. It was as though her feet were nailed to the ground. This was the nightmare she had never dared to imagine, playing out in front of her entire family. Kwame sat down casually next to Zuwena, his arm brushing her, his smile directed only at her. He didn't care about the stares. He didn't care about the whispers. He didn't care about his wife standing just a few feet away, broken and humiliated. Zuwena, bold as ever, crossed her legs and leaned back in the chair like she owned it. She gave a small smile, not shy, not apologetic, almost daring anyone to challenge her right to be there. Her confidence was a knife, and it cut deeper than any insult. The silence stretched long and heavy. Amina could feel her world collapsing, piece by piece, right there in her own home. Christmas Eve, the night she had dreamed would be filled with love and family, had turned into a stage where her pain was on display. Everyone was watching. No one moved. And Amina's heart whispered the truth she had tried so hard to avoid. The storm she had feared had finally arrived. The food was ready, steaming and filling the room with the scent of Christmas spices. Amina had spent the whole day preparing it, hoping it would bring her family together. But now, as everyone gathered around the table, her hands trembled so badly she could hardly hold the serving spoon. She tried to steady herself, forcing her face into calmness, though inside she was breaking. Kwame, who should have been at her side, didn't even look at her. Instead, he turned his attention fully to Zuwena. He leaned close, speaking into her ear as if they were sharing private jokes, and the sound of her laughter rang sharp in Amina's ear. When it was time to pour drinks, Kwame took the wine bottle from the table and, without hesitation, filled Zuwena's glass first. He smiled at her, his hand resting lightly on hers as though she were the rightful queen of the evening. The room shifted with uncomfortable energy. Some guests coughed to cover their shock, others bent their heads low, whispering behind their hands. The children, innocent and confused, stared openly, their wide eyes darting between Amina and the strange woman who now sat in their mother's seat. Every gesture, every glance, felt like fire pressing against Amina's skin. She moved quietly, serving the food as though nothing was wrong, though her heart screamed. With each plate she placed on the table, she felt the weight of betrayal pressing heavier on her shoulders. No one spoke up for her, not even Madame Efua, who sat with folded arms, watching everything like it was a play made for her amusement. When Kwame reached across the table to adjust Zuwena's napkin, as though she were a delicate princess, Amina's breath caught in her throat. Her husband, the man she had shared her dreams and her life with, was publicly tearing her apart in front of the very people she wanted to impress. It was not just betrayal, it was humiliation. Whispers swirled through the room like smoke. Cousins exchanged glances, sisters-in-law leaned close, gossip dripping from their lips. Can you believe it? Right in her face? How shameless. Amina heard them, though they tried to keep their voices low. The sting was unbearable. It wasn't only her husband who shamed her, it was the silence of the family who chose to watch instead of speak. She kept her head bowed, her hands busy, her voice soft when she answered questions. Inside, she was screaming. Inside, she wanted to cry, to demand answers, to throw Zuwena out of her home. But her body refused. Her father's words, remembered from childhood, whispered faintly at the back of her mind. Patience, my daughter. Silence is not weakness. So she stayed quiet, her pain hidden behind the mask of a dutiful host, while her husband paraded his mistress like a trophy. The food she had cooked with love turned bitter in her mouth. Christmas, once her favorite day, now felt like the cruelest punishment of all. And though no tears fell, everyone could see the storm raging in her eyes. Amina moved from plate to plate, spooning out food while her hands trembled so much she almost spilled. She blinked quickly, trying to hold back the tears that kept pushing at the corners of her eyes. The laughter at the table felt louder, the whispers sharper, the glances heavier. But she did not let a single tear fall. Not tonight. Not in front of them. She forced her body into action, her face calm though her heart was breaking. Every step to the kitchen, every return to the table, felt like walking barefoot on glass. Yet she carried herself with grace. She placed the bowls gently, she smiled faintly when a child looked her way, she nodded politely when someone thanked her. No one could see how her chest ached. No one could see the storm twisting inside her. At one point, her eyes caught Kwame's. For a second she thought he might look ashamed, that maybe he would turn away from Zuwena and remember the woman who had built this home, who had cooked this meal, who had stood by his side for years. But he didn't. He looked past her, as if she were invisible, and poured another glass of wine for his mistress. Amina felt her heart shatter again, but still she held herself tall. As she leaned over the table to serve more food, her father's words came back to her. She could almost hear his deep, calm voice in her ear. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes, silence prepares the stage for thunder. She breathed those words in like medicine, letting them steady her. Her silence was not surrender. Her silence was strength. She remembered being a little girl, watching her father settle disputes in their community. He never shouted. He never rushed. He let others exhaust themselves with noise, and then, when the time was right, his calm, powerful words would silence a whole crowd. That memory lit a small fire inside her chest. Tonight, she too would not shout. She would not let anger destroy her dignity. Her silence was her shield. It was the last piece of herself that Kwame could not take away. He had taken her trust, her joy, her Christmas, but he would not take her strength. The more he flaunted his betrayal, the more determined she became to hold her head high, even if her heart was bleeding. Around her, the family kept watching. Some pitied her, some judged her, some stayed quiet out of fear. But Amina knew they were all seeing something else too. They were seeing a woman endure the deepest humiliation without breaking, without lowering herself to the same shame that had filled her home. And so she continued, serving food with steady hands, even though her body trembled. Her silence grew heavier than all the whispers, stronger than all the stares. It was the silence of a woman who knew her thunder was coming. The room was thick with tension, heavy with whispers and the sound of forced laughter. Amina moved like a shadow, serving food she could no longer taste, holding herself together even as her heart collapsed inside her. Kwame leaned closer to Zuwena, his smile wide, his voice loud, showing off his mistress as though she were a prize. Amina's silence wrapped around her like a cloak, but inside she felt small, almost crushed. Then it happened. A sudden knock echoed against the door. It was firm, steady, and so loud in the uneasy silence that it made everyone freeze. The children stopped chewing, forks paused midair, and heads turned toward the sound. Amina's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't expecting anyone else. Kwame frowned, annoyed, but before he could stand, the door opened. And there he was, Baba Idris. A tall man, his hair now streaked with gray but his back still straight. His presence filled the room before he even stepped fully inside. He wore a simple white kaftan, but on him it looked like authority itself. His eyes, sharp and piercing, scanned the room slowly. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to move quickly. The moment he entered, silence fell like a heavy blanket. "Good evening," he said, his voice deep, calm, but carrying weight. No one dared to answer right away. Even Madame Efua, who often found words ready for every situation, pressed her lips together and sat straighter in her chair. Amina felt her knees weaken, but this time from relief, not despair. Her father had come. She hadn't called him, hadn't expected him, but God had sent him at the very moment she needed him most. Baba Idris stepped forward, his eyes passing over the guests until they landed on the table. And then on Zuwena, sitting tall, bold, in the chair that did not belong to her. His expression did not change, but the silence in the room grew sharper, heavier. Everyone could feel the weight of his judgment even before he spoke. Kwame shifted in his seat, clearing his throat, suddenly less confident than he had been a moment ago. Zuwena tried to hold her smile, but her hand tightened on her glass, her painted nails tapping nervously against it. The room that had moments ago echoed with gossip and whispers was now so quiet that even the crackle of the lantern flame could be heard. Amina lowered her eyes, tears welling up again, but this time they were different. Not of humiliation, not of despair, but of something she hadn't felt all evening, hope. Her father was here. The man who had taught her that silence could hold more power than noise. The man whose very presence made liars stumble and the arrogant tremble. The knock had changed everything. The night that had been filled with shame now shifted, like the first rumble of thunder before a storm. And Amina knew, in her heart, that the storm was no longer hers alone to bear. Baba Idris stood just inside the doorway, his presence filling the room more powerfully than any decoration or candlelight. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply allowed the silence to thicken as his sharp eyes moved across every face at the table. One by one, the guests lowered their gazes. Even the children grew still, sensing the weight of something far greater than their young minds could understand. Then his eyes stopped. They rested on Zuwena, sitting tall, smug just moments ago, now shifting uneasily in the chair that had no business holding her. The head of the table, the place meant for Amina. Baba Idris's gaze did not waver, and in that gaze was history, wisdom, and authority, enough to make the entire room feel exposed. His voice finally broke the silence, deep and steady, every word like a stone placed carefully on the ground. "Who gave you the right to sit there?" His hand moved slowly, pointing at the chair. "That seat belongs to my daughter." The room froze. No one dared to move. The words were simple, but they struck like thunder. For the first time that evening, all eyes turned not toward Kwame, not toward Amina, but toward Zuwena. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her painted lips trembling as though the answer had vanished from her mind. She tried to steady her smile, but it faltered. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, fingers twisting together, betraying her unease. Madame Efua coughed lightly, as though she wanted to intervene, but even she stayed silent. This was Baba Idris, the man whose rulings once carried weight in courtroom, whose voice could quiet a crowd of angry men. No one dared interrupt him now. Zuwena finally stammered, I was just, but her words cracked in the air. The confidence she had worn like perfume seemed to vanish under Baba Idris's steady stare. She glanced at Kwame for support, but even he seemed smaller, shrinking into his chair, avoiding his father-in-law's piercing eye. Amina stood near the wall, her hands still and her breath caught in her throat. She had never loved her father more than in that moment. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't cursing, but the power in his calmness made the entire house feel as though it were shaking. Baba Idris stepped closer to the table, his eyes still fixed on Zuwena. "You walked into my daughter's home, into her family's celebration, and you put yourself where you do not belong. Do you think honor is taken by force? Do you think dignity can be stolen with painted lips and boldness?" His words were measured, sharp, and they sliced through the thick tension like a blade. No one dared to breathe too loudly. The mistress, once proud and unshaken, now looked cornered, and Amina, standing silently, felt strength rise inside her chest. The truth had finally been spoken aloud, not by her trembling lips, but by the voice that had always protected her. In that moment, the room no longer belonged to whispers or shame. It belonged to truth, and truth had a voice steady and unyielding through Baba Idris. Baba Idris let the silence linger after his words to Zuwena. Then slowly, his eyes turned to Kwame, the man who once came to his home, nervous but determined, asking for his daughter's hand. The man he had trusted to protect Amina, to honor her, to love her. Tonight, that same man sat beside a mistress, grinning like a child who thought he had won a game. "Kwame," Baba Idris said, his voice steady but sharp. The name alone made Kwame stiffen. "Look at me." Kwame hesitated, then slowly lifted his eyes. For the first time that evening, his confidence cracked. He shifted in his seat, his hand moving away from Zuwena's as if even touch betrayed his shame. "When you came to me years ago," Baba Idris continued, "you stood tall and swore before God and family that you would love my daughter. You swore you would cherish her, protect her, and build a life with her. I trusted you. I gave you her hand because I believed you were a man of honor." His voice grew heavier, though never louder. "But tonight, you have shown us all that you are not a man. You are a coward." Gasps moved across the table like a wave. Some guests looked down quickly, others froze with wide eyes. Amina's heart pounded, her breath unsteady, as she listened to the words she had longed to hear but never had the strength to say. Baba Idris stepped closer to Kwame, his presence towering even though he never raised his voice. "A real man does not humiliate his wife in her own home. A real man does not walk into a family gathering with disgrace on his arm. You sit here, smiling, while the woman who has cooked for you, served you, and carried your name is crushed before your very eyes. And you do nothing." Kwame swallowed hard, his lips parting as though he wanted to speak, but no words came out. His chest rose and fell quickly, his face beginning to glisten with sweat. The room watched in silence, every eye fixed on the scene. "You thought your silence made you strong," Baba Idris went on, "but it only revealed your weakness. A husband who cannot defend his wife, who cannot honor his vows, is no husband at all. You brought shame into this house tonight, not just to Amina, but to your children, to your family, to your name. And for what? For pride? For lust? For foolishness dressed in red." His eyes flicked briefly to Zuwena before fixing back on Kwame. The words sliced through the air like blades. Each one landed heavy, cutting deeper into the silence. Kwame lowered his head, unable to meet his father-in-law's gaze. The arrogance that had carried him into the house with his mistress was gone. All that remained was shame, raw and heavy, visible to everyone. Amina stood still, tears finally gathering in her eyes, not from humiliation, but from the justice she had been waiting for. Her father had spoken the truth, and in front of everyone, Kwame had no place to hide. Zuwena had entered the house like a queen, her head high, her red dress shining, her smile daring anyone to challenge her. She had walked straight to the head of the table, as if the place had been waiting for her. She had laughed loudly, sipped her wine proudly, and acted as though Amina were invisible. But now, with Baba Idris's words hanging heavy in the air, all that boldness began to crumble. Her shoulders, once squared with confidence, slowly dropped. Her hand shook as she tried to lift her glass, but she set it back down quickly when she noticed the tremor. She looked around the table for support, but everywhere her eyes landed, she met only cold stares. Those who had whispered and mocked Amina earlier now avoided Zuwena's gaze completely. Others looked at her openly with disgust, shaking their heads as if ashamed to even be in the same room with her. The whispers had changed. No longer were they about Amina's silence, her weakness, or her failure to hold her husband's heart. Now they were about Zuwena. Shameless woman. Look at her, sitting in another woman's place. Doesn't she fear God? The words slipped across the table, sharp and unforgiving, cutting into the fragile wall of confidence she had tried to rebuild. Zuwena's face burned. She shifted in her seat, tugging at the edge of her dress, uncrossing and crossing her legs nervously. The head of the table, which had once made her feel powerful, now felt like a trap, a spotlight exposing every inch of her shame. She glanced at Kwame, hoping for him to rescue her, but he sat small and silent, his head bowed under his father-in-law's judgment. He could not save her. Madame Efua, who had stayed quiet through most of the evening, finally leaned forward. Her voice, though calm, carried venom. I warned my son that pride would ruin him. But you walk in here and think you are a wife? You think beauty gives you the right to destroy a home? Foolish girl. Her words fell heavy, and though she had often been harsh toward Amina, tonight her anger found a new target. Zuwena's lips parted, as if she wanted to defend herself, but no words came. The confidence that had once dripped from her every gesture was gone. She sat trembling, her eyes darting around the table, searching for a friendly face, but there were none. Even the children looked at her strangely, their innocent stares holding a quiet accusation. You don't belong here. The room that had once seemed hers to conquer had turned against her completely. Every whisper, every stare, every silence was a weight pressing down on her shoulders. The same family that had been laughing, eating, and gossiping a short while ago now united in their judgment of her arrogance. Zuwena, once the bold mistress who thought she could humiliate Amina in her own home, now sat trembling, her pride stripped away. In one night, before one family, she had fallen from grace. And there was no recovering her crown. Baba Idris let the silence linger, the weight of his words still pressing on every heart in the room. Then slowly he turned to his daughter. His eyes softened, the sternness melting into something gentle and proud. He reached out his hand to Amina, and she stepped forward, her steps small but steady, her head slightly bowed. He led her toward the table. The very chair Zuwena had tried to claim now stood like a throne waiting for its true queen. When they reached it, Baba Idris placed his hand firmly on the back of the chair and spoke, his voice deep and clear. This seat belongs to my daughter, Amina, the wife of this home, the mother of its children, the woman of dignity who has endured tonight with silence and strength. The words broke the room open. Some of the women covered their mouths, tears shining in their eyes. A few guests clapped softly, the sound building slowly, respectfully, until it filled the room with warmth. Even the children, sensing the moment's power, clapped their small hands together. Amina lowered herself into the chair, her trembling hands resting against the table. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. She did not smile, she did not boast, but her presence in that seat spoke louder than any words. She had been humiliated, betrayed, mocked, but now she was restored. Zuwena sat quietly in her corner, her head lowered, the sparkle of her earlier confidence gone. Kwame looked down at his plate, unable to meet anyone's eye. But Amina sat tall, her father standing proudly behind her, and in that moment the Christmas she thought was ruined was reclaimed. It was a night the family would never forget.